Netflix terminates partnership with Archwell Productions due to tax controversies and potential IRS probe. We're halting all projects, including Meghan's new series, and seeking compensation for costs incurred.
The story didn't break quietly. It detonated. One minute, Archwell Productions was still being spoken about as a prestige Hollywood player attached to royalty, glossy values, and billion-dollar ambition. The next, whispers hardened into leaks, and leaks into something far more dangerous. According to multiple industry insiders, Netflix had finally had enough, not of slow timelines or creative disagreements, but of risk. Real, legal, reputational risk. At the center of it all stood Ted Sarandos, a man known in Hollywood not for sentiment but for results. When he moves, it's rarely emotional and almost never reversible. This time, the message was unmistakable. The Archwell partnership was over. All projects halted, and Netflix was allegedly seeking to claw back roughly $20 million in advanced costs tied to projects that never materialized. What made this rupture different from previous Hollywood divorces was the reason cited behind closed doors. This was not framed as a creative failure, it was framed as an ethical one. Insiders claim Netflix's internal compliance teams flagged mounting concerns connected to Archwell's financial structure, particularly the blurred boundaries between nonprofit activity and for-profit production work. The alleged trigger was growing chatter of a potential IRS probe, still unofficial but serious enough that Netflix lawyers reportedly urged immediate disengagement. In a post-scandal entertainment industry, no studio wants its name anywhere near a tax controversy, especially one involving charitable classifications. The irony is hard to miss. Harry and Meghan entered Hollywood branding themselves as disruptors with conscience, promising storytelling rooted in compassion, transparency, and reform. The Archwell name itself was meant to signal altruism, yet behind the curated messaging, critics have long argued the structure was confusing by design. A foundation operating alongside a production arm, shared staffing, shared branding, shared travel, shared expenses. To supporters, it was modern philanthropy. To skeptics, it looked like a compliance nightmare waiting to happen. As Netflix allegedly reviewed expense allocations, red flags reportedly multiplied, travel categorized as humanitarian outreach also appearing in development budgets, staff roles overlapping between charitable and commercial projects, consultants paid through nonprofit channels while servicing for-profit content. None of this has been formally adjudicated, but the mere possibility was enough. For Sarandos, the calculation was brutally simple. The upside no longer outweighed the exposure. The $20 million compensation claim is what turned a quiet termination into a public spectacle. Studios walk away from underperforming deals all the time. They rarely demand money back unless they believe contractual lines were crossed. Whether Netflix ultimately recovers a dollar is almost secondary. The demand itself functions as a signal flare to the industry. This wasn't just business disappointment, it was an accusation of breach, trust broken at a foundational level. And once trust collapses in Hollywood, reputations tend to follow. What follows now is not just a corporate dispute, but a slow unraveling of a narrative carefully constructed since their royal exit, one that may not survive regulatory daylight. The stakes could not be higher for everyone. What makes this moment especially damaging is how long the warning signs were allegedly ignored. From the outside, the Netflix deal was announced with triumphant fanfare in 2020, a 9-figure headline agreement framed as proof that Harry and Meghan had transcended royalty and become global media power players. Insiders now say the reality was far less glamorous. Deliverables lagged almost immediately. Development meetings stretched on without clear direction. Concepts were announced publicly before scripts were locked, budgets approved, or production teams stabilized. For Netflix, patience initially won out, largely because of the symbolic value attached to the partnership. Behind the scenes, however, executives reportedly began documenting concerns. Projects stalled not because of lack of resources, but because of inconsistent leadership. Multiple insiders describe a pattern where teams would be assembled, creative frameworks established, and then abruptly derailed by last-minute changes or prolonged silence from the principals themselves. The perception grew that Archwell functioned more as a branding vessel than an operational studio. That distinction matters in Hollywood, where execution is everything. As months turned into years, the imbalance became harder to justify. Netflix allegedly advanced significant sums for development, staffing, and early production work that never translated into finished content. Meghan's lifestyle series, once teased as a cornerstone project, became emblematic of the dysfunction. Pre-production reportedly consumed millions, while filming schedules repeatedly collapsed. Some staffers claimed they were left guessing whether projects were still alive at all. That uncertainty has a cost, and studios track it carefully. At the same time, the charitable side of Archwell was drawing increased attention. Public tax filings revealed revenues in the millions, but critics pointed to spending patterns that skewed heavily toward administration, travel, and public-facing appearances. Again, none of this is illegal on its face, but it attracts scrutiny when the optics clash with the stated mission. When those charitable expenses appeared to intersect with content creation, the situation reportedly escalated from awkward to alarming. Former employees, constrained for years by non-disclosure agreements, began hinting online at deeper dysfunction. Comments about absentee leadership, credit-taking, and relentless micromanagement resurfaced with renewed force. The phrase that circulated most cruelly was also the most persistent: show up, pose, leave. Whether fair or not, the perception hardened, and perceptions shape corporate decisions. Ted Sarandos is known for tolerating creative chaos when it produces results. He is far less forgiving when chaos produces risk. According to sources, once internal auditors raised the possibility that Netflix funds could be implicated in questionable accounting practices, the decision became inevitable. Termination was no longer about content quality, it was about containment. The alleged IRS probe looms large here, not because it has concluded, but because it exists at all. Studios do not wait for indictments, they act at the first credible sign of regulatory exposure. Netflix's move, insiders say, was defensive and decisive, designed to erect distance before headlines hardened into subpoenas. The compensation demand underscored that strategy, signaling Netflix viewed itself as a potential victim, not a collaborator. For Harry and Meghan, the fallout extends beyond money. Hollywood runs on perception, and right now, the perception is instability. Deals thrive on confidence, and confidence evaporates quickly when governance questions enter the frame. Even if no wrongdoing is ultimately proven, the damage may already be done. In an industry allergic to uncertainty, the Archwell brand now carries more questions than answers, and that alone can close doors faster than any court ruling ever could. What complicates the narrative further is the growing body of testimony from those who worked inside the Archwell ecosystem. While glossy press releases painted a picture of purpose-driven collaboration, insiders describe an operation plagued by contradiction. On one hand, there was obsessive control over optics, language, and public perception. On the other, there was a startling absence of sustained involvement where it mattered most. Teams were left to execute ambitious visions without consistent guidance, only to be overruled at the final moment by instincts that shifted overnight. Several former staffers have described an exhausting pattern. Weeks of work would be undone by late-night messages demanding rewrites, reversals, or complete conceptual pivots. Yet those same voices say there was little appetite for the unglamorous work of building systems, approving timelines, or committing to long-term strategy. The result was paralysis. Nothing ever felt finished, nothing ever felt approved, and nothing ever felt safe from sudden change. This leadership style reportedly bled into every partnership. Netflix executives, accustomed to tight production discipline, grew frustrated with the stop-start rhythm. Scripts would be requested, then ignored. Budgets would be discussed, then reopened. External producers were caught in the middle, unsure whose approval actually mattered. For a company built on scale and efficiency, this was more than irritating. It was unsustainable. High turnover became the unspoken scandal. Over a relatively short span, dozens of staffers reportedly cycled through Archwell roles, from senior producers to communications leads. Each departure was publicly framed as amicable, but the volume told a different story. In Hollywood, people leave bad jobs quietly. They flee bad leadership loudly, and the whispers travel fast. The Spotify collapse served as an early warning. Archetypes launched with hype and fizzled amid reports that much of the substantive work had been outsourced. While Meghan received top billing, others reportedly carried the production load. Netflix insiders paid attention. Patterns repeat across platforms, and what happens once can happen again. At the same time, the charitable branding created additional tension. Archwell's humanitarian trips were meticulously photographed, heavily publicized, and often fleeting. Critics accused the foundation of prioritizing visibility over follow-through, a charge that stung more as financial questions mounted. When philanthropy appears performative, regulators take interest. When it overlaps with commercial gain, that interest sharpens. Sources suggest Netflix's internal review uncovered not just financial ambiguity, but operational exhaustion. Teams burned out trying to satisfy shifting demands from principals who remained physically and emotionally distant from day-to-day work. One insider compared it to firefighting without water: constant urgency, no resolution. Ted Sarandos reportedly viewed this not as incompetence, but as incompatibility. Netflix thrives on relentless output. Archwell, by contrast, appeared trapped in perpetual development. Ideas announced, not delivered. Promises made, not met. When combined with compliance concerns, the calculus changed overnight. The alleged IRS probe may ultimately determine legality, but Hollywood has already delivered its verdict on viability. Studios do not gamble on partners who drain resources while amplifying risk. The demand for compensation reflects that reality. It is reimbursement for time, money, and trust invested without return. For Harry and Meghan, this moment represents more than a failed deal. It marks a collision between branding and execution. The image of visionary disruptors has given way to questions about discipline, accountability, and leadership. In an industry that rewards results above all else, symbolism only goes so far. Once credibility cracks, even royalty struggles to hold it together. And right now, the cracks are impossible to ignore. As scrutiny intensifies, another layer of consequence begins to surface, one that goes beyond contracts and audits and reaches into reputation capital. In Hollywood, perception often becomes reality long before courts or regulators weigh in. Even unproven allegations can freeze momentum, stall negotiations, and quietly close doors. Several agents and development executives have reportedly begun distancing themselves, not because of confirmed wrongdoing, but because uncertainty itself is toxic in an industry that moves fast and forgets nothing. The Archwell brand was built on moral authority, on the idea that purpose and profit could coexist seamlessly. That positioning magnified the fallout. When ethical questions arise around a brand that sells ethics, damage multiplies. What might be survivable for a traditional production company becomes existential for a values-driven enterprise. Insiders say this is why the Netflix break felt so final. It was not just about one project or one balance sheet. It was about alignment, or rather, the sudden absence of it. Public silence from Harry and Meghan has only deepened speculation. Crisis management experts note that silence can work when facts are on your side and resolution is imminent, but prolonged silence in the face of mounting detail often invites others to fill the vacuum. Former collaborators, donors, and staff begin sharing their versions, sometimes carefully, sometimes recklessly. Each fragment adds to a narrative that becomes harder to reverse with time. There's also the matter of donor confidence. Philanthropy relies on trust as much as transparency. Once questions arise about fund allocation or governance, even well-intentioned donors hesitate to pause involvement until clarity emerges. That pause alone can cripple operations, regardless of eventual findings. Charities do not collapse only from penalties, they collapse from doubt. Hollywood's reaction has been notably unsentimental. The industry has seen scandals weathered and comebacks staged, but only when accountability is swift and credible. Netflix's alleged demand for compensation signals a belief that remediation is unlikely in the short term. It also sends a message to other potential partners. Due diligence matters. Star power does not override spreadsheets. What makes this moment particularly precarious is timing. The streaming landscape is tightening, budgets are shrinking, executives are under pressure to justify every dollar. Risk tolerance is lower than it was when the Sussex deal was signed. In that climate, any partner carrying regulatory uncertainty becomes expendable, regardless of profile. Observers note that reinvention remains possible, but it would require a fundamental shift. Less grand narrative, more measurable output. Less performative visibility, more operational substance. That kind of pivot is difficult for any brand, especially one built so publicly and so quickly. For now, the Archwell story sits at an uncomfortable crossroads. Legal outcomes remain unknown. Investigations may conclude quietly or escalate dramatically, but reputational damage operates on its own timeline, often faster and more ruthless than any regulator. Hollywood has already begun moving on, and momentum, once lost, is notoriously hard to regain. Whether this chapter becomes a cautionary footnote or the beginning of a deeper unraveling depends on what comes next. Transparency, accountability, and sustained effort could still change the trajectory, but the window narrows with each passing day, and the industry is watching closely, not with sympathy, but with calculation. Now, the human element of this saga cannot be overstated. Behind spreadsheets, contracts, and audits are people. Employees who believed in the vision, donors who trusted intentions, collaborators who invested time and energy. Accounts from former staff paint a consistent picture, a revolving door of talent, constant unpredictability, and leadership that oscillated between absent and overbearing. One insider described it as a perpetual state of firefighting, where no one could ever feel secure that their work would be recognized or even completed. In such an environment, morale is not merely low, it is eroded to the point of paralysis. The emotional and psychological toll accumulates quietly, often invisible until the impact manifests in missed deadlines, staff departures, and operational chaos. This layer of fallout also reaches beyond professional circles. Public perception plays a critical role in the sustainability of any brand, especially one positioned as a moral or philanthropic authority. The repeated scrutiny, allegations of financial impropriety, and highly publicized operational failures erode trust, not just among donors or partners, but also in the audience that had once embraced the Sussex brand. Social media amplifies every detail, dissecting actions, dissecting appearances, and interpreting silence as culpability. In this context, perception is no longer just about reputation, it's about survival in a highly competitive, unforgiving media ecosystem. Meanwhile, the IRS probe adds a structural dimension that cannot be ignored. Unlike social media narratives, legal and financial investigations carry consequences that are formal, binding, and potentially transformative. Whistleblower claims, donor-advised fund audits, and intricate tracing of transactions form a web that can extend into penalties, fines, or even revocation of nonprofit status. Netflix's termination and the demand for $20 million is thus not merely a business decision, it is a calculated act of risk management. By severing ties and seeking compensation, the streaming giant mitigates its exposure, while signaling to the industry that ethical and financial rigor outweigh star power. Yet, there remains the potential for a strategic pivot, albeit a difficult one. Any recovery would require genuine transparency, structural reform, and measurable output. A brand that once relied on visibility and narrative control would need to shift toward operational credibility and sustained results. That path is narrow and steep, demanding both humility and discipline, qualities insiders suggest were historically in short supply. The challenge is compounded by the fact that public and professional scrutiny now exist simultaneously, leaving little room for error or gradual correction. The impact on collaborators, too, cannot be understated. Creative partners, co-producers, and technical staff are watching closely, weighing risks against opportunities. The fallout creates a chilling effect, where even experienced professionals hesitate to engage. Opportunities for meaningful content creation become limited, not due to a lack of ideas or talent, but because the structural and reputational risks dominate the calculus. Each postponed project, each withdrawn contributor further constrains the potential for recovery, creating a feedback loop that magnifies initial failures. Ultimately, this situation serves as a cautionary tale about the intersection of power, visibility, and accountability. High-profile individuals operate under intense public scrutiny, but celebrity alone cannot shield a brand from structural and ethical weaknesses. Talent, influence, and vision are insufficient when operational execution, transparency, and trust are compromised. The Archewell story illustrates how quickly a carefully constructed narrative can unravel under combined pressure from legal, financial, and reputational fronts. The narrative is ongoing, but certain truths are emerging. The duo's previous successes are being re-evaluated through the lens of operational oversight, ethical compliance, and tangible outcomes. Each revelation, whether through leaked documents, insider testimony, or regulatory investigation, chips away at the carefully curated image of influence and authority. The unfolding consequences suggest that recovery is possible only through rigorous accountability, not through narrative control or strategic silence. The lessons extend beyond any single household or production company, offering insight into the mechanics of trust, power, and transparency in high-stakes environments.